Thank you all so much for being here. I'm Veronica Roberts. I'm the John and Jill Friedenrich Director here at the Cantor. Thank you. And since this is a panel on service and care, I just wanted to start by saying what a dream team there is here in public programs who has taken such good care of our speakers and made a somewhat stressful how do you do a talk on the opening day with breakfast tacos only allowed outside and not inside and all this navigation. So I just want to thank Christina Linden, who is very busy making sure people are properly seated. And yes, thank you, Christina. And Vivian Sming, who is just amazing, and Kwangmi Rowe and Michael, the team here. Thank you so, so much. There are also a number of artists in the show who are not on stage. We will be talking about with these three wonderful individuals, and I will introduce them in a moment. But we're also so lucky to have so many artists from the exhibition here today. Would you just raise your hand if you are in the exhibition, if you are an artist in the show? A little higher, Sandy. A little higher. A little higher. Thank you. Thank you. It's really special to be able to share this show and to have so many artists and their loved ones here with us today. So the format of this talk is that I will begin with brief introductions of the three wonderful artists in the panel today, and then they will briefly, I have some fun questions for each of them that will begin each round, and then each of them will present their work in a nutshell. So I'm not going to read those boring bios of where they went to school and how many fellowships they've had and where they're in the collections of. I'm just going to tell you just a little bit about how I got to know them and how they ended up in the show. But what you're going to hear about today is how care manifests itself in the content, materials, and processes that artist caregivers employ in their artistic practices. And I also just want to point out, if you haven't seen the show, the caregiver section is on the second floor. And the fact that many of the occupations of caregivers have been and still are dominated by women and people of color registers, I think, in a meaningful way upstairs and in the panel here today. So first up is Lenka Clayton. Raise your wave. Thank you. Lenka is based in Pittsburgh. I have known her now for a decade. I was first introduced to her work when I was jurying or evaluating a very prestigious fellowship grant, and I ranked her #1. Full disclosure, she did not get the grant, but I became obsessed and decided I needed to meet this artist and started following her, and I saw that she had a work in this exhibition called State of the Art at Crystal Bridges. That was in 2014, and I was telling the two curators that I happened to be with in Bentonville, Arkansas. They had heard me like gush about Lenka like she was Taylor Swift, basically, of the art world. And lo and behold, I'm showing them this work, 63 objects taken from my son's mouth, a genius work, which is on view in the exhibition. And there's Lenka. She's just standing next to the work. Like, she doesn't live in Bentonville. I'm not normally in Bentonville, Arkansas. And I kind of lost it and kind of fangirled her. She had some artist books on her. We bought all of them. And it's been a wonderful journey ever since. I'm just so honored to be a friend, have her in the show. She'll be talking about artist residency and motherhood, and we're very lucky because she's represented by a gallery here in San Francisco, Catherine Clark Gallery. So I'm really thrilled that this show will not be your only chance to be introduced to her work. Next up is Jaylyn Gomez. So the moral of the story, I first learned of Jaylyn's work in August of 2015. I had to look that up. I had to look up the exact month. Jaylyn, the moral of the story is read your New York Times and support your local journalists, because there was a piece in the T magazine about Jaylyn that was written by Lawrence Weschler in 2015 that talked about her experiences as a nanny for a family in Beverly Hills and how that had impacted her artistic practice. And I was so taken with the piece that I wrote to the gallery, Charlie James. He had to get on a plane, but he was here earlier. I wrote to the gallery and I was like, I want to know more about this artist. When will you next have a show? and I acquired a work for the Blanton's collection in my prior job. And then I eventually also fangirled Lynn and met her at an art fair, I think in Miami was the first time. I nearly knocked her over. I was so excited to meet her. What was really beautiful is when I acquired a work of hers for the Blanton, it was also a teaching institution. It was used for teaching so extensively. The minute it went on view, it was one of the most requested works. And it's an image, it was a painting that it was inspired in part, it's an image of the Broad Art Center, Broad Museum in LA. And there's a woman pushing a trash can receptacle who's clearly cleaning the street in front of the painting. And I'll never forget the day that I installed that painting. Our custodial worker at the Blanton walked by, stopped. She had a trash can on her. It was a Monday. And she said, and she was singing. She had this beautiful voice, and she was singing in the galleries. And she looked at the painting, and she stopped, and she goes, "That's me," and then kept singing. So anyway, you're going to hear from Lynn, but her art is incredibly impactful, and you'll be seeing, there's 2 works, and well, actually there's like 6 or 7 works in the show that we'll be talking about this afternoon. Last, but definitely not least, in the center there with the fabulous pants, Violette Bule, and yes. And Violette's work I was introduced to in March of 2022. So she is the most recent addition to my obsessive constellation of artists I love. And I will never forget, I had just gotten vaccinated in Austin, Texas, a couple days, early March 2022. And I was so ready to get out of my house and so tired of being at home. So I got in the car, I drove to Houston, and I went to all the museums. And Violette's work, Homage to Johnny, was on view at the Blaffer at the University of Houston. And it was a work that just stopped me in my tracks. I was already pretty far along in the development of the show, but if you haven't been upstairs yet, and you'll see images of it in her presentation, it's a work that is an homage to one of her coworkers at a bakery in Lower Manhattan where they work together. And it's a grate, you know, the kind of grates that you see on the sidewalks of major city streets. And she hauled a grate back from New York in her truck back to Houston, and friends contributed magnets to the piece, and then she threw and flung thousands of forks into this piece. And it was to recognize her coworker who didn't speak English or Spanish, who was undocumented. His name is Johnny. I don't even know if you knew his last name. They did not share a language, but they shared a space of labor and of working. And he worked in the basement, invisibly, quietly, for $5 an hour, polishing all the silverware. And it's an arresting work that, as I've spent more time with it, I realize it's an altarpiece. It's a 3-part grate that has been turned into an altarpiece, and it's a really beautiful, beautiful work. So I think one of the things that she's really adding to the show is thinking about also the kinds of labor that is legal, what is legal, what is, you know, and how many jobs in this country, in the United States, are performed by people who aren't from here, who are not being paid properly, but who are so essential to the economy. And so I think that it's such an important contribution that you've made to the exhibition. So there is my personal introduction to these wonderful 3 artists. So now I am going to sit down, transfer mics, and start the program. But let me start with a great question. Name 3 day jobs you've had.
One of the first one day jobs I did in New York was delivering perfumes for a fancy perfumery, and I love that one. And the other one was pasting posters for advertising, biking in Queens, and then baking and waitress and bus runner and all that. Yeah.
Thank you. And what about you, Lynn?
It's funny, most of mine actually have still dealt with kids. I had a instructional and recreational aid job at an elementary school where my mom's a custodian in San Bernardino, California. So I was her co-worker a little bit. Loved having my breaks in her custodial room when I was working there. I also worked as a soccer coach independently for toddlers. So I actually was in Santa Clarita. It was around the time I was at CalArts, so I was trying to find places, and I had already a childcare center job there. So that was the third one too. But they kind of bled into by the childcare center. Lots of people there were always like, "Oh, you play soccer? Can you coach my child after school too?" So it was natural, and I found a company in that area. But yeah, 3 different day jobs like that.
I love it. But don't ask her to coach your children. She's very busy with her art career now. All right, we're going to start the presentation, so head on up to the podium. I feel like a DJ here or something.
Well, thank you for being here today to listen our story. So I just want to take this opportunity to, now that this show is unveiling a lot of stories about making art, I want to just unveil this story about the pieces that I have in the show. So I'm a Venezuelan. I have been living in the States since 2014. I left Venezuela right when the humanitarian crisis started to escalating tremendously. And I started looking for opportunities in different places everywhere. So I've got the chance to come to United States to do a residency in Miami, and a friend of mine invited me to go to New York and visit her. And for sure, I was totally in love with the city, and I tried to look ways to stay longer. And then I applied for a artist residency visa, and I got it. And then I rent an apartment, and then my money just went away. And then I started looking for different kind of jobs to, pay my bills, pay my rent. And I was a little bit struggling because, learning how the functionality of the city, learning a new, country, trying to adapt, trying to, as you see, being a second language problem. And it was really hard for me to, manage all that. And I will say something about my connection with this show after this. So I was working, I never worked in Venezuela in the service industry. I was doing photography, teaching photography. I was doing all the type of work. But then when I was in New York looking for work, I was able to do everything. Like, do you know how to, be a bus runner? Of course, I have plenty of experience, and I haven't. I was such a big liar, I was like, trying to learn at the same time that I was like surviving. So this is Dream America, and it's a photograph. It's a part of a whole series of work that is a mixed media, and it's 11 pieces that are part of this project. And I was trying to translate what I was feeling, what I was seeing, and inverted the word, the American dream, instead of, using the Dream America, is to tell the story of how we are making the dream, making the facade of the dream. We are the one who are building this idea of the dream because we are the servers. And then in this case, she's with her eyes closed to her reality and with her eyes open to the dream. And she's my friend. I met her in New York. She's also Venezuelan. She's a filmmaker. Now she's living in Sao Paulo, and now she's working as a filmmaker happily. So since I was studying photography, I was in love of the work of German photographer August Sander, and I decided to like, for me, I'm not saying this like I did this for the rest of the world, but I was trying to update these images from the 20th century to the 21st century. So I was playing around with this idea of August Sander for Dream America. And one of the things that I was having in mind when I was doing this sketch, when I keep this since, one day it was a raining day, and I was like waiting for because I was a baker, as Veronica mentioned, I was waiting for the yeast make the work. And I was drawing, then I was so obsessed with the photograph and what I was seeing, and the story that other friends that I met that I was working in the restaurant were telling me about. So I was thinking this idea of how we bend, how we, we convert into things. We have our personal life that we left behind, and now how became, like something else. And at the beginning, I was thinking in the mirror, and then it became what it is, Dream America. I'm sorry, as it is. Let me see if I'm missing something, because, second language, we need to type down. So for this project, I didn't want to talk about immigration things or related to the vulnerability of being an immigrant, because I never saw the hierarchy in the kitchen, for example, as a weak thing. I saw the dynamics and the power, and then the way how things can impact you if you're a woman in the kitchen, if you are Venezuelan and not a Mexican, or if you are speaking English, or if you have paper or not, if you cross legally or not. So I was like amazed of all those things surrounding about being an immigrant working in the kitchen. So I never felt like it was really hard. It was wild working in a restaurant. It was very tough, and I learned a lot. And I learned how to defend myself and be in the position like, yeah, I can do this. And also the one of my friends who was doing the bread for Match to Johnny, I will tell you about that in a minute. He was a guy, a big guy, and then he was doing the bread, and then he was friend of everybody. And then when I arrived to take his position, it was really difficult to make them respect me and all that. So I wanted to talk about the power dynamic, and then the power structure, and all those. Also the revolving door that is related to us in consumerism. For example, that we work, we bought, and we send back. So there's that Dream America. And then, like my friend Ernesto, who was making the bread in a different restaurant, we were bartending together in the Lower East Side in Manhattan. He got a better job, a better offer, and he asked me, "Do you know how to make bread?" And I said, "Never in my life." And then he teach me like in a couple of nights, and then I became a baker. And I was there. I was working early in the morning, around 4 a.m. And there was Johnny. I don't know. I don't think his name is Johnny, but everybody called him Johnny. And I was obsessed with Johnny because he was a beautiful, shy boy, very humble, and he always was willing to try my bread and my stuff. And I was talking to him about blah, 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 and I didn't know that he was even understanding or interested in what I was saying. But yeah, the sound of his work, his hands, his humbleness, and all that dedication, and also the unfair that he was experiencing that touched me, and then I was just thinking about him. So I decided to do an homage to him. I was, you can imagine that I was bartending and baking bread, and the next day, so I got fired after being late twice. So fortunately, so I didn't get the chance to see him again. I don't know what happened with Johnny. So to unveil the magic, this is the grades from the basement. One of the, I don't know, I found it in the street, and I take it and I ensemble it again. And these are magnets recycled from motors and speakers that I was dismantling, and I was doing that in my apartment, which was my studio. And I'm going to tell you what that apartment became after. But yeah, I was collecting magnets, and you know what? The guy who was saving me the magnets, his name is Johnny too, and he's from Haiti. So I was going to deep down south of Brooklyn to this junkyard, and he gave me like a bunch of magnet full of grease, and I would clean it up, and then I was going to different places where, you know, where they change the speaker of the cars, and they save me the speakers, and I was dismantling the speaker from 11 to 2 when I have a free time in my apartment, 4th floor. The neighbors hate me, but I did it. So, so that was, this is the magnets, and then so on. So, and this is like a photograph from the original place. So, yeah, and then the forks. The story of the fork is that I start receiving forks from friends as a gift. I have to be honest, I love to steal forks from restaurants, so don't invite me to go to your place, I will steal your forks. So the sculpture is growing every time, it's growing and growing, and then I don't know for how long it will be, but now it's 1,700 forks sticking on the, and then when I was so frustrated, I remember that I was in my apartment, and sometimes I got so frustrated with the things that I was doing, I just dismantling the whole forks and started throwing again as a therapy. So I wanted to tell the story. I didn't know that this will become in a sculpture, in a photograph. So I was doing this storytelling about the commute, about all that. But fortunately, it happened, and it became in this piece. And something that I wanted to say thank you to having me in this show is because it made me think in a different way, because as an artist, you wanted to create, and you are, you know, willing and looking to make your work understandable to others. You are concerned about the forms, you're concerned about aesthetics, you are willing to have work that is contain a lot of power in their forms, and I didn't get the chance to think, and didn't get the chance to think in me and how I survive, how I manage all of this. So when Veronica invited me to the show and invited me to tell the story about Johnny, I got the chance to think like, of course, I did this because I'm an artist. I was able to navigate all this and to survive to this and to learn, because I knew and I know I'm an artist, and I was able to step behind and then, you know, step away a little bit and see everything as an experiment. And that helped me, that you know, saved me. So thanks for that. And then in the same apartment, a couple of projects that I'll show very quick is someone in my bed. So at some point I stopped working in the bartending, keep the baking, because now I'm very good doing sourdough baguette. I did this someone in my bed when I was renting my room to strangers, and I started taking photographs of my guests in my bed. So I was sleeping in the sofa, and they were staying in my room, and then as soon as I have them, I decided to invite them to be part of the project, and now I have a friend around the world. And these are my first guests that I have. And then when I moved to Houston for a fellowship in the Houston University, I started driving a car, and I was doing Lyft, and then I started taking photographs of my passenger, keeping tracking of the money I was making, the money that the platform take away from me, the data of the drop-off and pick-off, and then all the story that I left behind looking through the rear view mirror. And this is me in the restaurant back in 2015. Thank you.
Name one time you felt seen as a care or service provider. Seen.
Like they confused me with...
They appreciated you.
Appreciated.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. Yes. Many times. I'm sorry, I was distracted because I just finished the thing. So I was like, did I say everything right? But yeah, yeah, I don't know. I don't get the question.
Too many. Okay, so one time where you felt appreciated or valued for care or for service that you were providing.
Yeah, I mean, not many times because I was working behind the scene. I was making the bread, and it was when I was delivering the perfumes. Like I met people, and it was really interesting. But I didn't get the chance to be in front of. Well, when I was bartending, I got a lot of free drinks for clients. So that's the truth.
That caregiving is better appreciated. That's true. Yeah, that's true. All right, what about you, Jalen?
I think when I look back to my experience nannying, I do remember having a moment where if I was in the home with the children and there was visitors to the house, people would address me. I mean, the mom would introduce me. Oh, this is Jay. At the time, I went just by Jay. This is Jay. Jay is our nanny. And like, I would be introduced versus definitely the housekeepers were often not introduced. So I started picking up on that. But I will say back to the scene component, obviously I was a part of the family. They treated me as such. They use that terminology a lot in that work, and that work constantly says that. It's like, oh, you're a part of the family. But I would have questions, which goes into the work eventually that I'll talk about. And these questions were always like, am I really part of the family? Am I able to have this apartment, but then also bring up complicated issues? Like, would I get fired? So I was always on like this thin ice feeling, and eventually got too much. So I would take the kids to the park. And as I was taking the kids to the park, I met other nannies, and other nannies would often be like, you speak English, you play with the kids, you're working with twins, but you're only getting paid how much? And so I do remember having a real tense moment with the family and having to kind of like change diapers, but passive aggressively with the mom. And I knew the emotions were riling up because I was like, okay, wait, I have this apartment provided. I'm told that this is the right rate, but nannies are telling me no. And so I didn't know how to hold that. And eventually things definitely burst. And so we had a major issue in the house. We talked about it. The kids were down for, their nap. And I was just having a conversation with the mom and eventually discussed what I was going through. And she at first was shocked and was like, wait, you all talk about this? And she was kind of shocked from that perspective. But when she kind of sat down and listened to me, her and her husband definitely heard me and understood that I was providing way more than just the physical care. And they found a middle ground because I was living with them. So that, things that they had thought were okay and kind of passed over were obviously not. And so they added things like, here's the break time that you actually get to have a break. And in that break was where the work would come from. So I felt very valued once I was able to find the words to it. But as I'll bring up in the conversation, it's very much a difficult thing to find words when the labor itself and the job itself doesn't have any real rules or regulations or any way of oversight for it.
That's really interesting. Well, thank you. That's a perfect segue to invite you up to the podium.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Lynn, and I will go right off the bat and speak the obvious. I am Lynn Gomez, but I used to go by a name named Ramiro Gomez, and I have a hard time expressing that, but I have to come to terms because I established a whole career with that name. That's inevitable. I will go back to Ramiro, and Ramiro was going by Jay for junior in 2009, and I had just dropped out of art school, and I needed stability in this really turbulent time. So the nanny job came from these child care center jobs and elementary school jobs that I earlier referenced in some of the questions that I was posed to. I always had child care as part of my core job skill, I guess. Never fit in with any 9-to-5 jobs, office jobs. I never could figure that part out. My parents hated that, but here I am as an artist, right? I will say that back in 2009, I had dropped out of school, but I also will mention that I had lost a very important person to me, my grandmother. And she helped raise me and my sisters and other family members growing up while my mom and dad worked physical manual labor jobs. My mom was working in factories, my dad's a truck driver. So of course, their demanding jobs didn't allow them to take care of us. So if I was home for the summer, I would stay with my grandmother. And as one of the oldest children, my grandmother and I were very close, but she didn't speak any English. So she helped raise me and my siblings and my cousins, but you know, the generational differences started coming around. And I will say that as a child of immigrants, there's a guilt that comes into play with that, that I didn't know until I started working in the very job. And my mom immediately was like, you're not going to do the job that I worked really hard to come to this country for you not to do. I remember having to really defend taking this nanny job because I said to my mom, I was like, look, I really don't have any other choice. I want to stay in LA. This family is a really great family. It had come naturally from a previous relationship I had, who also was an editor in television, and the family was entertainment industry. And so my partner back then had said one day, this editor had come in and needed a nanny because their nanny had dropped or left them abruptly. So I had childcare experience, and they asked me to go up to the Laurel Canyon area and take care of these tiny little kids. They were 6 weeks old when I took over, but at this point they were already 6 months. And this is when I first moved in and was living with them. As you can see, the baby Bjorn was my go-to thing to carry them. The children were very different, but I had to maneuver schedules. I was very much, yes, a nanny, but also was a estate manager, family confidant, therapist sometimes. Those are definitely skill sets that I had to kind of like tap into. But in the job, I remember thinking, as I took the kids and was able to go to the parks, thinking I was working with other people, and these questions would start coming up. Yes, I'm part of a family, but am I really able to say to people, this is my family? Because more often than not, that fine balance exists where we would be able to sort of have to prove ourselves almost in order to maintain our job. And that was what our family component was depending on in a lot of ways in domestic labor. I will say that these photographs were taken around 2010, 2011. So I was starting to figure out how to come to terms with these questions that I had, but also in the process, I was working with people. I mean, these are two nannies that I worked with, and intimately, obviously, were aware of my artistic kind of thing. So I was documenting, but I wasn't sure yet what to do with these things. So they would just let me do my thing with my cell phone. I always carry that cell phone. I'm constantly taking photos. That's still part of my practice. But back then, these are moments that were just intimate for me to kind of like think about what I did as an artist or as a nanny, but also as an artist trying to reflect it. Found a way through magazines that were thrown around the house that I used to work in. The mom was a designer. Excuse me, let me go back to that first one. The mom was a designer, and these luxury magazines were in the space, but didn't have the people that I was seeing working with me in it. And I remember struggling with that feeling of like, why are these people not in here? But at the same time, how do I include that? And that's, I think, a transitional component. As an artist, I realized others weren't talking about it, so it kind of was up to me. And that's never an easy thing to do. So I started painting people that I worked with. And then these were actually hidden. So a lot of the magazines early on, I kind of found a folder and I put it into my little bedroom. And when the housekeeper would come in, or housekeepers would come in to clean my room, ironically at this house, I was nervous that they would come up to the magazines and see that. And then I also was nervous that the family that I worked for would find out. So I didn't know how to talk about these, but I did remember ripping the pages out, having a folder, and thinking, okay, let me play with the actual advertisement. Mitchell Gold and Bob Williams and Maria is just a little joke of it, right? But it's funny how back then I just was thinking about labor and observing labor. Meanwhile, it's not about just the labor. These people are people beyond just that job. So I was also thinking about my own parents and how my experience with family members that did this type of care goes beyond it. And so in pieces like this that are in the gallery above, you know, people like Maria, my mom is named Maria, were kind of the references that I was using in this context, not working, but rather waiting for a check and thinking of where to place them, obviously, is a skill set. I was always looking at the actual magazine, trying to figure out where the places were, and sometimes immediately it would stand out. In other cases, it wasn't so obvious, so I had to kind of work around. But it was a way for me to kind of let go in the moment as a nanny. Right after that series, though, and once I started thinking about these issues, the job lasted about 2 years, 2.5 years. I remember thinking how much the magazines were important, but also the city itself of Los Angeles didn't have any of these issues being spoken about. So I found a way to use cardboard and other materials to execute installations outdoors based on people that I was observing. And this definitely got a lot of attention. I ended up getting a show at the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center that gave me a chance to exhibit the magazines for the first time, and some of these paintings that I started thinking about, going back to that nanny job. In a context of this is the actual day that I took care of these 3 kids. The twins were there and they were playing with a neighborhood child that I also was taking care of. But I would see outdoors this man that was the pool cleaner, Osvaldo, and he would come every Thursday, and I would see him working around the pool, but meanwhile, being inside the house, it reminded me of a famous artist that y'all may recognize. I will say that that painting definitely was focusing on the pools and the jump, the splash, versus mine was about taking away that splash. So I wrestled with how to articulate. It became no splash. As you can see, I was also using my formalist aspects back to the magazine work, trying to figure out where to place the figures was an issue, but I still found it. I did not want to do karaoke, so that was a very specific piece that I was trying to place, but that was also the transition component when I went from a nanny to an artist. This piece was at the CSRC show, and it got the attention of Charlie James Gallery, which eventually gave me a solo, and I was able to reproduce the piece to scale. Many pieces in that series reference the Hockney era of the 60s homes that I was working in, and I think back to that period as a very major step in the direction of professional establishing my career. But I've always dealt with these scenarios as an artist. Back then I was nannying, yes, but also thinking with art, and as an artist now I'm still painting about these issues, but oftentimes encountering the nannies now in collectors' homes. So my work with sorry about this scenario, because there's just so much emotion that comes into play, and as a real emotion I will float into something like this piece, Paul Smith, which is a very famous wall in Los Angeles that gets a lot of social media attention. It's coming from that same rawness back to the magazines. Where are the people that are working? Who gets the attention? I remember knowing the people that were working in painting the Paul Smith wall and thinking about entertainment industry's role in all of this and who's actually credited with the care and maintenance of it. So this is from my show. These are 2 paintings about Melrose from my show On Melrose at Charlie James Gallery in 2016, which leads me to a piece that's in the show now called Melrose Avenue Eastbound. I have not seen that yet, so I think the emotions that's getting to me is because I have not seen some of these pieces that came from this very real experience for me. I drove every day to a studio to work on that Melrose show, and that era of me is so far removed now. I remember getting in the car and thinking, wow, this facade in this house looks incredible in the context of this restaurant, Gracias Madre, but then referencing the nanny and the caretaking back to these people that I was working was obviously a moment in this series. I was also wrestling with a lot of the famous artists like Ed Ruscha's iconic Every Building on the Sunset Strip piece, David Hockney's aesthetic choices of Los Angeles and portrayals, but then thinking, okay, well, can I insert the context of other buildings that are not so aesthetically Los Angeles and mix them in? And I will say that back to this series, it's about wrestling with this. It's about being an artist still and seeing all this labor still happening constantly, that people are taking care of this, the women that are cleaning in the restroom as this opening is happening. It's always about breaking down these moments. So in the context of this piece that's also in the show, where do I put the gender issues? The woman is obviously the security as opposed to the male figure. These are pieces that wrestle with this. I want you all here to kind of wrestle with this experience and not take in day jobs as just this show, but also a real experience that all of us artists that have day jobs still go through, might incorporate into our work and might not. The first version of this show was exhibited at the Blanton, and I will tell you that when I saw the first version of the show, I had a reaction immediately to seeing a portrait of me from my previous self. And thinking back to that day, Veronica took a photo of me in a dress at the opening in front of the magazine collages that were arranged back then there. And I immediately went back home to Boston after that first opening and made this, which is now in this show as well. And it shows you how I incorporate some of this rawness. This work that is now coming into play is definitely unlocked. And I will say that considering everything that's going and being talked about here today, these are two pieces that are coming to terms with my position as a trans woman in the art world, and specifically as Ramiro Gomez now meeting Jalen.
Thank you so much, all three of you. Those were amazing presentations, and just so special to share so much with all of us. I have plenty of questions, but I also know that there's a pretty full, this is like the fullest audience we've ever had pretty much in this tiny little, very hot, auditorium. So I am happy to turn it over to any of you. We have mics that are, someone has a mic? Yes, Christina has a mic. If you have any questions for individual artists or for all three of them, please, you're just summon Christina and she'd be happy to ask. I think there's one in the front row.
My question is for Veronica. What were your day jobs?
I worked at a bagel store at Noah's Bagels. Does anyone know that? Noah's Bagels? Oh, yeah. I don't recommend, though, working. If anyone knows me, I am not a morning person, and I had the 5 a.m. shift. So I didn't get fired, but that was the last day job I ever had, and last job, period, I've ever had that started at 5 o'clock in the morning. It was terrible. Else. Yes.
So we've sort of talked about how the art world doesn't want to notice your day job. So the artist community doesn't look that direction. How about the other way around? Did your day job colleagues recognize you as an artist?
That's a good question. That's a great question. Take that, Violette?
Yes.
Does your mic still work, or do you want me to pass?
No, it's good.
Here, let me pass. Okay.
I got it. In my experience in the restaurant, I never would say that I was an artist.
Oh.
Because that was like not serious thing. Not even to say that I'm a queer person, or that I don't have a children's and established family. So, and in those scenarios was really difficult to talk about art or saying, I'm looking to you because I'm going to use you for my work. But no, in this atmosphere, it's very difficult to to talk about those things. So when I got the chance to have that kind of conversation with them, was coming from a different way to read what was happening. Like, what do you think about this and that? But never from the position of an artist. And well, sometimes when you are in a city like New York working as a bartender and you listen a lot of things and then people is talking to you and then you sharing and yes, I'm in Venezuela, I'm an artist, and then, you know, other things happen. Sometimes I also have opportunities because of that. But in the kitchen, like behind the scene, it was really difficult to say that you are also marginalized in a way because you're queer, you're not like a traditional person, and also an artist.
So the not serious thing goes both ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the essay for the book, which will come out hopefully this summer, it's on a boat somewhere, but Jim Campbell, who's an artist here in the Bay Area that many of you may be familiar with, he writes in his essay, he worked for Faruja Labs in Silicon Valley for almost 20 years, and he went by Jack Campbell at his day job, and then ultimately invited his coworkers to an opening that he had, and they had no idea that Jim Campbell, the artist, was Jack Campbell, their colleague. So, and Howardina Pindell talks about having this very divided personality, feeling like you're living these two lives that are very separate. So that came up a lot in the book, these sort of two separate lives. Yeah. I think that this show brings up a lot of questions around compensation and also structures within the art world that don't support artists. And so I was really struck, one of the things I was really struck is as a curator or director, so many artists advance in their careers by doing these residencies. Like if you have McDowell on your CV, oh my God, that's a big deal. Or you have Skowhegan, like that is gonna help you make a living and be a successful, serious artist. And so you called attention to the fact that having children made it hard for you to continue doing these residencies. And it made me rethink like the whole structure of artist residencies. And I will say, even since the beginning of I've known you since nearly the beginning of that project, it has changed so much. There are so many more, those of you who are, younger artists, that isn't the case now. There are, of course, there are still residencies where you can't bring your spouse or your partner or your children, but even that, like, we can make these changes. We need to recognize the structural problems and think about how artists advance and how they're able to support themselves better. And I should have plugged one of the greatest residencies in the Bay Area, the Headlands, where, I should have plugged that. Great residency that does not subscribe to all the structural problems that we're discussing. Anyway, had to say that. There was a question somewhere in the back there. Yes.
Hi. What I find really fascinating is artists have this kind of floating power situation. They're not working for anybody. They're kind of sort of culturally on a cloud. And in these day jobs, you had a situation where there was a distinct power structure, and you were at the lower side of the power structure. And I wonder, did you resent the people that had more power and had some amount of power over you?
Oh, yes. Seemed to be an emphatic answer from Violette. I'm going to pass the mic.
Well, yes, to be honest, it was like I said, working in the kitchen was really tough. And but like in life, you have people that you just love, you boss, and you love, and you're still friend of that person. But there's other people that, that using their power because they have more time there, or because you, like I said, you're a woman, or you're new, or you're not part of the family because you're coming from a different country. And it was, yes, there's one guy.
There are no homages to him.
No homage to him at all. But yeah.
Yeah. I have a question. All great presentations, great works. I have a question for Violette regarding the forks piece, the altar. You mentioned that it's an evolving because you are getting more forks. So how are you dealing with all these issues if I don't know if the piece is owned by an art institution or somebody. So is the molding in the piece, and so you throw more forks to the piece and ask the owner to throw 1,000 more per year, or is a different piece that you are building now, or how are you dealing with this material you're getting? This is one, and the second is does that thing travels all together, or somebody in the institution changes the piece so the piece is modified every time you exhibit it? Or you are the one who come and put all the forks?
Thank you. That's a great question because I have to think about it. So, yeah, I like to, for those kind of works, I have a couple of works, so 3 works that is still growing in time. I would say if someone collect the piece, I have to have some kind of arrangement with that person to let me exhibit the work in different places and let the piece grow when I have more forks for the piece. So I will continue it, like, no matter if you have the piece and then keep it growing, and then there have to be like an arrangement with the person who get it. And I have to learn how to let it go and let institution do the thing, but I always try to put it together because I talk with the sculpture. I talk with Johnny when I'm installing the piece. So I'm very dedicated with this work, and then each forks, like many forks that I brought to this show, that new different forks from Blanton, coming for trips and gift and all that. So it's also an homage for the own piece. So yes, I like to install it myself, but I trust in people can do it itself too. Thank you.
Hi there. I don't know if I have a question yet. My body is still kind of buzzing from what I just saw. You'll have to excuse me. An hour ago, I didn't know this existed. And 3 days ago, I decided to come to the Bay Area for a family event that happened yesterday. And my flight back home is today. And I thought, what kind of free event can I go to? And I came to the museum, and I was supposed to get a tour. And there were no tours available today because this was happening. And so someone gave me this wristband, and I was like, I don't know if I want to go. I don't always understand art. And then I came in here and sat down, and I live in Houston, Texas, and I'm a nanny. And I don't see myself in art. And this is incredible because now I can and now I do. And I work quite a lot on the national and international nanny and domestic worker stage. Like my day job is I'm a nanny, but I do a lot of unpaid labor with domestic workers and with nannying and making this profession more professional. And like you said, an arena that is wildly unregulated, and most nannies don't look like me or talk like me or have the citizenship in this country like I do. And this is going to be amazing, and I will post this everywhere, and I can't wait to go upstairs and see the work. And it's just so interesting how this happened. And again, like sort of thematically, I don't know how I got here, but I know I was supposed to be here, and so I just really thank you for this work.
Hello? I will immediately thank you for the courage it took to just stand there and say that to everybody, because honestly, I think back to when I presented my magazines for the first time to people. It was initially online because I was so scared. Back to that moment that I said earlier, sharing it was the scariest moment because I didn't think of myself as an artist at first. I was just nannying, and I needed to depend on that job. But then that transition happened literally where I was like, okay, I'm going to events and people are talking about some of these issues, but I don't know how quite to put it. Or I will say a lot of the rawness that I'm still feeling is because I think about how much of a vacuum I was working under. I was living in Los Angeles in the Beverly Hills, Laurel Canyon area, so far removed from other areas that normally had manifestations and demonstrations for domestic workers' Bill of Rights. But it's almost like I was sitting there as a nanny going, wait, why is this parades, or not parades, but like, why are these protests and these demonstrations happening in downtown LA versus why aren't they not walking through Beverly Hills with all of us? Why are we not allowed to get out of our job and step out of line? So stepping out of line like what you just did, following your own intuition, I really want to acknowledge that right now. And then at the same time, it shows you the power of art. That is very unexpected, but back to how I shared then eventually a moment after a lecture that I also walked into at the UCLA, for the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center at the Autry Museum in Los Angeles. I had just put together a portfolio of my magazines, and I found out that there was an event at the Autry around Chicano art, and it was part of the Pacific Standard Time initiative that they did back in 2012. So I was starting to kind of figure out how to articulate this work, and I remember going to this event randomly on a Sunday morning too, and I sat in the audience immediately seeing a keynote by this professor named Dr. George Lipsitz at a UC Santa Barbara, and his keynote, in all of what he was mentioning, I had no idea what he said before because I got there right at the tail end, and in that moment he said, any artist in the audience, I will say, you are working in your studio all alone by yourself without anybody hearing you. Nobody's going to tell you anything. But after you go out and share that, it's most social of work. And this is a perfect example where you followed your intuition. We've sat and had all these engagements and years of work, but now we're all communicating together and finding a nice moment to kind of come together and take this beautiful exhibition with all of our voices, not just us four that are up here, but everyone else's communally. For those of you in the audience like yourself that was not aware before, but now is, and others that maybe were and came specifically for the show are now seeing it in a different version. So yeah, thank you for being here.
I think it's pretty much time. If there's one last question, we can take one last question, but otherwise I'm going to encourage everyone. Is there one last question?
I actually have a last question.
You have a last? Okay, Christina, you get the last question.
I never do this.
No, you never do this.
Following on that question and just thinking about how many times in my own life I've omitted the stories of my day jobs as I worked nights and weekends to get through school. Just want each of you maybe, you know, the example of making up a residency is one, but if you can talk from your own experience about the small things that have allowed you to feel empowered to continue doing the hard work you do to get to this place, and how that might be a suggestion for other people about how they can make the spaces of the art world more welcoming and more accessible to people who don't automatically feel like they have purchase there to begin.
This is the first time for me that one member of my family is seeing one of my work in 18 years. So my sister is here, and it means a lot to me. Like it's been very lonely and family-wise. And another thing that I would add is that I love to find people seeing the piece and saying to me, I was a waitress. And I remember when I was working in the, bartending and to pay the school and that. So thank you for sharing that to us too.
I think back to the first version of the show at the Blanton, I remember how beautiful it was to speak to a group, but then seeing the museum guards there. Remember that, Veronica? Like they were so excited to hear about my work or our work together. And as we were speaking, you could see them engaging. I'm sure here, plenty of people that are just working and observing us. Speaking about the day job, they're living a day job now. And as an artist that's working professionally, yeah, it's hard to think back to that moment. I sometimes like to think that when I was taking the nanny job out of the necessity, it was almost as if I was placed there as opposed to chose it, right? And I just responded to what was presented to me in the moment, right? Later on, it's practicality. It's just here's this item, okay, now I'm gonna make it. But then there's other components that come into play. Recording, that's not always easy for most people. Some people remember. I don't know if you remember that moment of taking that photo, but I love seeing that photo in there. It's just like, I think it's just in the moment acting on that rawness. And I think as you shared also, Lenka, it's like we're making our art worlds, we're all kind of collaborating here. And in the space, this group is now witness to this, that perhaps you wouldn't get out of a recording, you definitely wouldn't get online. It's about being together. And so I'm really grateful to be a part of this and giving it a little bit of my experience so that somebody can pick up for themselves like how that helps. And then the show itself will give insight to others, in their practices that maybe perhaps somebody doesn't have the practical sense from one of us here, but then if they're up there, they can talk to the artists and see others work in conversation and how that affects them. It's the sharing of it.
All right, I think that's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you all so much for being here.